we're gonna talk just a little bit about this what I think is a pretty fascinating group of organisms. I on the screen, hopefully everybody can see, it's got Crayfish Expert on the top of the question mark. I always like to do a little disclaimer. I'm not necessarily, I don't consider myself a crayfish expert, but I have worked with this group of organisms for about 20 years. I worked on our department's crayfish crew for a little over 3 years on a couple of rivers down in the Ozarks, and worked on a research project down in the southeast part of the state on 2 species that are found only in Missouri and only within a portion of one watershed. So currently my position allows me to teach our Missouri stream team volunteers about all the macroinvertebrates, but I always hold a little special interest in my heart for crawdads and work really hard not to take up too much time during our trainings. Let's see. There we go. Now, ecology is actually the study of crayfish, and it comes from the Greek, meaning of the Greek astikos, which means lobster. Back in the day, everything that crawled and looked like lobsters or crayfish, they were all called lobsters. And so it wasn't until about the 1800s that we started to realize that the marine lobsters and our freshwater crayfish were actually pretty different organisms. So a crayfish expert is actually called an asticologist, and I always joke that's with one S and not two. So as I mentioned earlier, Eric and I got our heads put together and worked on this and thought, well, this webinar might be a pretty good way to give some information on a group of organisms that probably most of you don't know a lot about. So we're going to talk about what a crawdad is. We're going to talk a little bit about classification and distribution. Again, what I want to point out is we've only got about an hour, so we are just barely going to scratch the surface on these. And I hope that it actually generates some more questions on things that we didn't really get a chance to get into very much. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding and appreciation, A, of what crawdads are, but also kind of their role in the ecosystem, and more importantly, the emphasis on this is why not to move some of these guys around, because one of the topics we're going to talk about is the issues that are caused when they get moved into new environments. So just to let you know, I'm not completely pulling everything out of my backside. I've done a fair amount of reading the literature. I've got some of our Department of Conservation data that I'm going to show you, but I'm not going to flog you with data. Don't worry about that. And a lot of it is just my own casual observations of being out and being in the field and some of the work that I've done on them personally. So one of the first questions that I usually get asked is it crayfish or is it crawfish? And I always joke that the answer is yes. Both crayfish and crawfish are acceptable in the scientific literature. One of my, I don't know what you want to call it, it's not really a passion, but one of my interests is etymology, or finding the root meaning of these words. And the word crayfish or crawfish actually goes back to the old German Krebs, which means edible crustacean. And in fact, in modern German, Krebs still means crab. So the old French speakers, let me get back here, there we go, heard this and in their Frenchy way softened it up to crevice. And this was first written in a document sometime around 1311 and 1312. Now, when the English lost the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the conquering French speakers brought crevice with them, but the way I've read is that the tin-eared Brits heard fish at the end of the word, and so they started calling it crayfish. And this actually appeared in literature in about 1955. So at about this time, the English language was really starting to evolve and hybridize, and things were changing awful quickly. And so eventually you have the two terms in modern English, crayfish and crawfish. And again, both are acceptable in the literature. Now, what about crawdad? This one was a little more interesting. It's a little harder to explain, but it seems to arise from this general impulse with folks from the South that tend to be colorful and whimsy and folksy with their language. And so maybe it has something to do with an old man that's sitting on his porch, that represents one of those burrowing crayfish that's staring out of its burrow. I don't know, but it really depends on where you are. Will help kind of shape what you call this particular animal. And it's interesting. When I did some work for a crayfish workshop, I ran across this dialect survey that was done by Bert Vox when he was at Harvard. And one of the questions was, what do you call the miniature lobster that one finds in lakes and streams, for example, a crustacean in the family Appendages? And there were a whole host of answers. Let me back up here. Josh, this last year, actually took that information and kind of retweaked it a little bit and came up with a little bit cleaner map that is showing now. There were almost 1,100 people that participated in that survey, and crawfish was the most commonly used at about 40%, followed pretty closely by crayfish with about 32-33%, and crawdad was actually the third most common term at about 20%. Now, what was interesting is that about 4% of those folks had some other name for it: mudbug, freshwater lobster, crawdads, craw crabs, crawdaddies, crawdy bottoms, jangas, which is actually the Creole term for crayfish. I had a gentleman down in Arkansas when I was doing one of these, called them ditch crickets, and that's my favorite term for these animals, are ditch crickets. But about 5% actually did not have a name for this animal, which I thought was pretty fascinating. So it's kind of interesting that there are about as many names as there are for names for this animal as there are for types of crayfish. We got about 380, 400 species just in North America alone. And we're just kind of starting to learn a little bit about them. I actually got this publication here from my wife for Christmas a couple years ago, and I very gingerly touch it because it's very old and kind of falling apart, but it's got a really cool quote. "Common and lowly as most may think the crayfish, it is yet so full of wonders that the greatest naturalist may be puzzled to give a clear account of it." And so I hope by the end of this little webinar you've got a little better appreciation for these animals. And, the wonderful philosophers of Calvin and Hobbes also don't really know what these animals are. I had a gentleman that is a professor at Eastern Kentucky University. He told me that a crawdad is something I put on a hook, a crawfish is something I eat, and a crayfish is something I study. And I thought that was kind of a unique way of looking at it. So let's move a little bit into the classification. Hopefully you'll know that Dave Barry here is a humorous columnist, is a little off the mark. They're not actually insects, but they are kind of in that group. So as we look at the classification, they're all arthropods, they're all crustaceans. The big thing is that they're all decapods. There's only 3 families of crayfish found worldwide, and the families Appendages and the family Camberidae are the only ones that are the only ones found in North America. Family Parasiticidae is the only family found in the southern hemisphere. So they're all in the phylum Arthropods, which is the same as the insects, but again, that's kind of where the similarity ends. They're all crustaceans, which means they've all got these paired mandibular jaws, maxilla, and 2 pair of antennae. This includes things like sow-bugs and scuds and shrimp, crabs, crayfish, lobsters. And then they are all decapods, which means that they've got 10 legs. And that's a pretty key characteristic to get down to this group of organisms. Other characteristics, they've got the first 3 appendages are called chelate, or have little claws on them. the big set of claws that are very obvious and have probably pinched you, but the next two set of legs also have little claws on them as well. These include shrimps, spiny lobsters, crabs, and crayfish. And if you look at that list, you may have started to come to the realization that, hey, these decapods they're pretty good to eat. There's a little chain of restaurants called Red Lobster that has made kind of a killing on the selling of decapods for food. And most people that I've run across, when you mention eating crayfish, they talk about, or they think about the Cajun boil with cayenne pepper and corn and new potatoes. However, crayfish worldwide are a pretty good source of protein and for food. Native Americans would bait reeds with venison, and they would actually catch bushels of crayfish and use those as a protein source. Some of the miniature crayfish that are found in Mexico were very important to the Aztecs. In Scandinavia, crayfish boils are huge, but they use salt, sugar, ale, and a lot of dill in the seasoning of the meat. The French actually have a Nantua sauce, which is a white sauce made with crayfish. It's very nutritional, low in fat, high in protein, high in essential vitamins and minerals, and it tastes pretty good too. So they're very delicious and very good for you as well. So let's talk a little bit about the North American families. Again, we've got Asticidae, which actually has origins over in Europe, and then family Camberidae, which has its origins in North America. And there are 12 genera of crayfish that are found in North America, 11 of which are in that family Camberidae. So out on the west coast, there's only one family of crayfish that are native out there, and that's the genus Passifasticus. There's 5 species, 2 of which are possibly extinct, and then there's one that has 3 subspecies. And again, these are all found west of the Rocky Mountains. Once you get east of the Continental Divide, you really start getting into the crayfish diversity. Again, it's got the 2 subfamilies that we talked about before, 12 genera, and about 375, 380 of those taxa are found between the Atlantic Ocean and the Continental Divide. Most of these are in the southern Appalachia area. So, speaking of, that's a good lead-in for distribution, where you find these guys. Worldwide, about 650 taxa. Now, when I start throwing around numbers, I usually try to say about, because exact numbers it really depends on who you talk to. I always joke that taxonomists and systemists are either lumpers or splitters. So the numbers keep in mind that those are general numbers. Again, about 380 found in North America. There are more that are found in Mexico and Cuba, but there has not been a lot of taxonomic work done in those areas. So kind of take those numbers with a grain of salt. But what you'll probably notice is that North America is the crayfish hub of the world, which is pretty neat. And within North America, there's 2 smaller hubs. One is that Cumberland Plateau found in southern Appalachia, and then the Ozark Plateau, which I'm familiar with in Missouri. Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and a little bit into Kansas. So if we step back and look at the number of families that you find worldwide, remember I said that the family Parasticidae, let me get my, there we go, Parasticidae is found in the southern hemisphere. Crayfish are native to every continent in the world with the exception of Africa and Antarctica. Now that brings to me a couple interesting points. You've got crayfish that are native to Madagascar, but not native to the continent of Africa. And they have found some fossil records of a crayfish-like organism in some of the excavations that they've done down in Antarctica, which is pretty interesting. Now, when you move up to the northern hemisphere, you've got this weird disjunct distribution. You have in red the family Camberidae, which again is, remember, is the crayfish hub, so to speak. But then you've also got members of that family that are native over here to the eastern portions of Asia. And then you've got this family Asticidae, which has its origins, remember, in Europe, except for this group over here on the west coast, which is in the same family. And the theory is that before these continents broke apart, their distributions were a little more uniform, and then as in geologic time, as that stuff split apart and those continents began to drift, then you had these populations get isolated. So within North America, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just wanted to point out here are the where the crayfish are native on the west coast, that in that family Asticidae. The other ones, the most widely distributed and representative of the taxa are Orconectes, Cambarus, and Procambarus. Those two genera represent the most number of taxa as far as taxa richness goes. So let's talk a little bit about the morphology, because in order to know what kind of crawdads you have, you got to know what to look for, and there are some things that are very specific to crayfish. One of the things that's not actually is the exoskeleton. A lot of the invertebrates have an exoskeleton that requires them to molt in order to grow. We're going to talk about molting in a little bit because of its importance on the reproductive life cycle of these animals. This exoskeleton is critical for defense. It's unbelievably tough. And in fact, when I was doing some reading in early medieval Europe, it wasn't uncommon for some of these poor pikemen that would actually collect crawdads and make vests, armor out of the carapaces or the shells of these crayfish, and they were called Dovner doublets, and were unbelievably effective at stopping arrows. If somebody were to shoot an arrow past 15 yards, it would actually stop that arrow from entering somebody's chest, which is to me pretty incredible. Again, as I mentioned, they've got 10 legs, and the chela are the pinchers up front, and the ones that are probably one of the most obvious characteristics of these animals, that they use them for defense, for mating, but also for burrowing. They have two sets of antennae, which they use for locating food, but also locating prey, predators. They can actually smell a fish swimming in the water above them and say, I think I need to get under this rock or get under this log or burrow down so I don't get eaten. And when we start talking about the ecology and where they fit into the food system, you'll get a better understanding of how important that might be. They do have gills and have to uptake oxygen in a manner very similar to fish. Now, those gills are actually inside that carapace, and they suck water in and push it across those gills then in order to extract the oxygen from that water. Now, because of that, they can actually survive out of the water as long as those gills remain moist. So, for example, when I was working on the crayfish crew, we'd go down and we'd work in the Ozarks all week long, and we had these square meter samplers with a big bag on the back, and so we'd sample and we'd pull all the crawdads out and weigh and measure, and very tedious work, which was perfect for an entry-level hourly job to sit out in 100 degrees on a sandbar and do that. And it was Friday, it was late, we were ready to get home. We rolled all our equipment up, put it in the back of the truck, drove 2.5 to 3 hours up to Columbia, and Monday morning got back in the truck, drove back down to where we were sampling, unloaded everything, and as we unrolled the net, this crayfish crawled out. And so it had survived in the back of a truck for 2 days with it being 100 degrees, but there was enough moisture in that net to keep it alive. Now, it probably wasn't very happy, but it didn't kill it, and that was pretty enlightening. The other thing, if you've ever actually tried to catch these by hand, they use that fan-shaped tail and that highly muscularized abdomen in order to escape, and they're very, very, very good at doing that, and do so in a backwards motion. Excuse me. They also have their eyes are up on stalks, and they've got little lenses all over their eyes, and so that gives them a mosaic world of the world, or of the environment in which they live. And again, considering when we start talking about the ecology of these animals and where they fit into the ecosystem, it's very important that you develop morphological adaptations so that you're less likely to become a meal for something else. Now, I mentioned the word carapace earlier. The body of these animals, you've got the head and the thorax, which are fused, and that whole thing is called the carapace. So the carapace runs from the tip of the acumen, which is the pointy part between the eyes, all the way down to the edge of the carapace, the hard part. And then everything else, these segments are all the abdomen, and then you've got the tail. So we talked a little bit about the antennae and the fact that they've got two pair and that they're used for sensory organs. But they've also got, when you start identification, it's important to know where the acumen is, which the acumen is this very, very pointy part and is the end of the rostrum. And the rostrum goes from here all the way up to the point. And one of the things that I sent Eric that he said he was going to post was an actual glossary. One of the big stumbling blocks for identifying crayfish is there are some terms, morphological terms, that are specific to crayfish. And so if it's something you're not familiar with, that glossary will help out quite a bit to know where on the animal to look. The other thing is this marginal spine, where this other arrow here is pointing, that will set the acumen off from the rest of the rostrum. So if you flip this animal over, this is where a lot of the detail is. They've got these chewing, grinding mouth parts. They use it for grinding up food, but they also use it to move water across their gills in order to get oxygen. They use it for grooming. They use it to keep clean, and those are all right up in here. Also, as you are doing identification, it may ask about the antennal scale and the shape of the antennal scale. Well, that structure happens to be, if you were to flip it over, it's very obvious right here, and you can take your fingernail and put it right up there at the spine and actually move that appendage out in order to see the angle, and I'll show you some pictures of that a little bit later. As you move down onto the thorax, remember they've got 10 legs, they got 5 pair, and the first one are the most obvious again. Those are the pinchers, and they're called the chela. But the next 2 are called chelate, which means that they have these little claws at the end of those, which they use for grooming and for food manipulation. Now another thing that's interesting is depending on what kind of crawdad you've got, either the second, the third, or the fourth pair of walking legs, each of these have 7 segments. However, you want to look to see if there's hooks that are present. And these hooks develop after one of the molts when they are reproductively active, but where and how many of those hooks are present will help guide you to determine what kind of crayfish you've got. Now, as you move down to the abdomen, you've got these pleopods, or these swimmerettes. Now, you can actually tell the difference between mommy crayfish and daddy crayfish. And the males actually have these first pair of gonopods, or first pair of swimmerets, are modified into what are called gonopods that are used for sperm transfer. The females don't have any modification of these, but they will then glue the eggs to the swimmerets in order to incubate them, move water over them, keep them oxygenated, keep fungus from growing on them until such time that those eggs hatch and your hatchlings then become free-living organisms. And then the sixth segment here is called the telson. You've got the median telson and then these lateral uropods. That's just the technical name for the tail that it uses to probably frustrate you as it's scooting backwards downstream or upstream and you're vainly trying to grab at it. So let's look at some actual photographs here. These are the gonopods. Again, those are the first pair of swimmerets that have been modified into sperm transfer organs. Now, I bring this up because if you're going to use keys, the keys are based in large part on the size and shape of these gonopods while they are in a reproductively active form. So that, in a way, can kind of limit you if you want to make a positive identification on these animals. But when we start talking about gonopods, this is where on the animal we're looking at. So you can, the next time you catch a crawdad, flip it over, and you can see if you have a male crawdad like this one or a female. Females have this annulus ventralis right here, which is the sperm receptacle, and then has gonopores at the base of these walking legs where she'll actually extrude those eggs in the spring in order to fertilize them. So if you put them side by side, you can see you got a female on the left and a male on the right. Usually pretty obvious to tell which ones you've got, especially when you have an adult. So let's talk a little bit about the life histories and population biology of these guys. This is going to get a little busy, but I'm going to start in the spring because I love spring. I'm not a big fan of winter. Usually by the time March rolls around, I'm ready for it to start warming up and ready to go fishing again. So when the water temperatures hit about 8 degrees Celsius or about 46 degrees Fahrenheit, these animals start to become more active. They come out, they start moving around, and at this point the females will then oviposit or lay the eggs. It's also interesting at this point, this is when she'll fertilize those eggs. So when we get down to the fall and winter, keep that in mind. So in those eggs, she'll oviposit, she will fertilize those eggs, and will keep them on her abdomen, glued to her abdomen. And then in a month-ish, it really depends on species, water temperature, amount of sunlight, so on and so forth, or amount of daylight. These eggs will then hatch, and the young a year will become independent. Now, when those young a year become independent, the rest of the population tends to molt. And this is kind of a mechanism that gives these small crayfish a little bit of a head start because you've got little tiny invertebrates that are food for a lot of other things. And so when all the other adults molt, they hide because they're all soft and they themselves are more susceptible to getting eaten. And it allows these juveniles then to start to spread out and hopefully begin that whole process. So August through September, there's another molt. And at this point, the males molt into what's called Form 1, or reproductively active. It's also about this time that you get some older members of the population that will die off. Now, in October and November, so here pretty close to this time of year, you're going to have these adults molting and you're going to have mating occur. So the males and the females mate. She then stores that sperm internally all the way until spring, when she will then oviposit those eggs and then fertilize them. And then again, once that 8-degree magic number is hit, they don't really hibernate, but they will crawl under rocks and just not move around very much. When the water gets cold, they just aren't very active. Now keep in mind, this life cycle works for pretty much all of North America with the exception of the Northeast, where it's a little cooler. Up there, the copulation actually occurs in the March time period. And so they will then mate, and then the female will oviposit the eggs, and it will go from there. But for most everybody else, including even the Pacific Northwest, from what I've read, this copulation occurs in the fall. Now, I have seen, here in Missouri, I have seen an exception to this, but it was on the 11 Point River, just downstream of Greer Spring, which is a very large spring. And I was actually collecting crayfish for a workshop, and I came up with a female that had eggs in the fall. So to me, that it makes me think that there was something to do with water temperature, and maybe that's a little area that's different because of that large spring. And then during the winter months, those eggs then develop internally, and then, like I said, she will oviposit those in the spring. All right, let's talk about molting, because this is a critical time for these animals. They have to molt in order to grow, and what they will do is, in order to shed that exoskeleton, they start to kind of shake themselves out where this arrow is and back themselves out of that gap that forms between the carapace and the abdomen. And then what you have left is something like this. You have the actual critter here, and then on the bottom for the digger crayfish, that's the shell. That's the old exoskeleton. On the spot-handed crayfish, you've got the actual organism here, and then up on top is the molted exoskeleton. And I will admit, I have more than once picked up what I thought was a crayfish, only to find that it was the molted exoskeleton, because it has the antennae, it has the coverings on the eyes. It's incredible at how lifelike those can look. Now, once that crayfish molts, it's going to be very soft, because it has a calcium carbonate shell that has to reharden. And at least for our crayfish in Missouri, since all but a handful of watersheds are I just lost my train of thought. Have a calcium bedrock, limestone bedrock. They tend to, and the water's pretty hard, they tend to be able to assimilate that and harden up pretty quickly. I would suspect in areas that have lower amounts of calcium and have softer water, that this hardening period can last a little bit longer. They're very susceptible to predation. They're very susceptible to pollution. It's, like I said, it's a very traumatic time for these animals. The adults will molt twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall, as we mentioned. The young of year can molt 10 to 12 times in that first year as they're growing like crazy. The other really neat thing is that they can regrow appendages. It is not uncommon for crawdads to lose claws. They're very solitary, agonistic, angry animals. And it's not uncommon for them to fight and to lose appendages. So in about, 2 to 3 molts, you can end up with, for example, this grassland crayfish, you'll end up with the one on his or her right claw will eventually be the same size as this. But in order for that to happen, it's that only occurs during the molting period. Now, the other thing that I alluded to earlier was this, what's called cyclic dimorphism. So from about, what did I say, April through September, the males are in what's called Form 2, or non-reproductively active. Their goal is to eat and to gain energy and to grow. During the fall, they molt into what's called Form 1, or reproductively active. And the gonopods actually change size and shape. You go from this non-reproductively active form that is blunt, is hard, and tends to be maybe tinged in red with some of the crayfish, into something that what's called the primary process, or this top one here, that gets longer, it's soft, and can be kind of a corneous yellow. And so you'll know if you've got a male that's reproductively active by grabbing a crawdad, flipping it over, first identifying, okay, it's a male, and then you actually, the easiest way to do it is to feel those gonopods, and if they are hard and needle-like, it's either juvenile or hasn't yet molted to reproductively active form, and if it's soft, then it's, its goal is reproduction. So let's talk a little bit about this. In general, most crawdads are sexually mature after their first year of growth, and for most of the populations, they, October, November, they begin this copulation. So the males begin roaming the stream bottom looking for a mate. Now, they can't tell if it's a male or a female. So if they encounter another male, guess what? They're going to fight. And one of them will probably end up losing a claw. There's been a lot of work done on dominance and size and aggressiveness on these males. But if he happens to find a female, then initially there's some antenna waving. If the female will push the male away, but eventually she will resign, and he will use those larger claws in order to pin her down, and those hooks that I mentioned earlier on those walking legs in order to mate. And at this point, they will stay like this for anywhere from an hour, and I've read up to 10 hours, and then transfer that sperm to the female. Now, he's able to do this. This is an Ozark crayfish, Orconectes ozarki, and you've got the female on top and the male on the bottom. And they're about the same body length, body size, but the male has much larger claws. And this is what allows him to essentially overpower the female and mate with her. Now, once that happens, if it's a successful copulation, the female forms what's called this sperm plug. That is this calcified material that forms over the annulus ventralis. Now, there's some discussion on the function of this thing. Some believe it's to retain sperm and keep it from essentially leaking out because it's being deposited into a hard structure. Some say it's to keep from diluting the sperm from the water, since these are aquatic organisms. Some have postulated that it's actually to help prevent a female from mating with another male. However, some recent genetic work has shown that a female can actually mate with multiple males and have a clutch of eggs from different males. So I don't know. That's still kind of up in the air on the actual function of this thing. But if you happen to find a female that has this sperm plug, it's a pretty safe presumption that she has successfully mated. Now, once this happens, she's got glare glands that are at the bases of these swimmerets. And so you've got a female here that the glare glands are not active, and then the female on the right, they are active. And this is the glue that she will use in order to keep those eggs attached to her abdomen. So as she extrudes the eggs, they're coated with the glue, and then she deposits them here on these swimmerets. And this helps, again, glue it to her body. At which point, she's said to be in berry. That's the non-technical, quasi-technical term for ovigerous. And it's pretty self-explanatory because in this case, it looked like a clump of grapes. I've seen blue ones like this, purple, orange, black, cream-colored. It really depends on what kind of crayfish you've got, but they look like a little clump of berries. Now, again, after, I don't know, a couple, 3 weeks, depends again on species and water temperature, these eggs will hatch. And they are glued to or attached to the mother by a thin thread for the first 2 molts. So in this stage and in the stage in the middle, they're still physically attached to the mother. Once they molt the 3rd time, they are actually a free-living organism and can theoretically swim off on their own. However, she produces this pheromone that keeps these babies close to her, and there's a little bit of parental care that goes on. But about the time that they're big enough to strike out on their own is about the time that she, as an adult, is going into that synchronous molt that the rest of the population is going to do, and that pheromone disappears, and that's the cue for these young-of-year crayfish to start to scatter throughout the stream or the lake and start life on their own. Now, one of the questions that I normally get is, how big do these guys get and how long do they live? In Missouri, we've got one of the smallest and one of the largest crayfish. On the top here is Orconectes macris. It's the Neosho midget crayfish. Its total length as an adult is about 1 inch long, as opposed to the long-pinchered crayfish, which is endemic or found only in the White River drainage in Missouri and Arkansas, and it can get up to 7 or 8 inches long, and even longer when you include the claws. Now, growth-wise, it will slow down during the wintertime. Again, they need that warmer water. They are sexually mature after their first full year. Most of them live 2 to 3 years. That tends to be the general average for our surface water crayfish. Now, those that inhabit caves have a much lower metabolism. They are the top predator. They can live, I've seen 20, 30 years. Now, there's a really unique species that's found down in Tasmania that actually lives 40 or 50 years, and it gets the size of lobsters. It's called the giant freshwater lobster, and it's a completely, I don't know, I won't get too much into it so I don't go down a rabbit trail, but they can get up to 7 or 8 pounds. They can live 40 or 50 years, but they don't start to reproduce until they're somewhere between 17, 18, 19 years old. So very slow-growing, large-bodied organism. All right, let's talk about where we find crayfish. Can you find them on land? Every spring, I seem to get a phone call from, it seems like a preschool teacher, after a heavy rain that says, I found this crayfish crawling along the parking lot. And I said, does it have babies? And usually the teacher will say, yes, it has babies on its abdomen. And it usually turns out to be one of the burrowing crayfish that gets out and starts moving around a little bit in the spring. So while you can find them on land, that's not, they're moving from one place to another. In general, water equals crayfish. If you got water, chances are good you probably got crawdads there. Now, they can kind of space themselves out by what kind of crawdad they are and how old they are. There are some species that really like riffles. There are some species that really like deep pools. There are some species that like ponds or reservoirs and don't really do well in flowing water. There are some separation in age groups where, at least in some of our Ozark streams, we've got what's called water willow, which is a Justica species of plant that spreads by rhizomes and provides excellent habitat in the water for not only crayfish, but other aquatic invertebrates as well as juvenile fish. And it's pretty incredible at the densities that these animals will get within these pretty small areas in the stream. We've done some sampling, and they're not much fun to sample. I mean, it's pretty laborious to take a veg sample, but it's not uncommon during the spring to get 300 or 400 young-of-year crayfish in a square meter. So it helps them hide and helps keep them from getting eaten. Now, all crayfish burrow at at least a little bit. Most of the ones that we've got, and in fact, most of the crayfish are tertiary burrowers, meaning that they'll either burrow out of convenience, or they burrow in the winter to get down below the frost line. They burrow underneath a rock to keep from getting eaten. The females, as she's laying eggs and brooding the eggs, will hide underneath large rocks to protect those eggs. Occasionally, if the water body will dry up, they can actually burrow down to the water table if it's high enough. You've got secondary burrowers, which live most of their time in this burrow, but as you have a seasonal flooding, they will wander out into this open water. And some of the ones that are used for aquacultural purposes, particularly in the southeast United States, fall into this secondary burrower category, because during the dry months, the farmers will plant rice in these fields, and then during the wet months, they'll harvest the rice. The fields will flood. These crayfish will come out, or down there, the crawfish will come out, and then they will harvest the crawfish as a secondary source of income. However, we do have some primary burrowers that spend all of their life in these burrows, and they only come out in order to feed and reproduce. And a little bit of reading that I've done, it's amazing at how much material these little invertebrates can move. I've got here can move nearly 18 tons per acre per year. To me, that's a phenomenal amount of material that it can move. And if you've ever had them in a fish tank, I always call them little bulldozers, because they can restructure your fish tank every night. You get the rocks and the plants and everything set just right, and you come out the next morning and everything's floating and all the rocks are flipped over because it's not the way they wanted it. So they've burrowed to make it more of their liking. And you can see these burrow characteristics. They've got these chimneys that will form as they are burrowing down and balling up this material. They push it back behind them, and it forms these clay chimneys. And they can burrow down, to the water table, so up to 20 feet in some cases. Multiple tunnels. The primary burrowers will have a large room. I call it their little man cave. And then they can plug these up during dry periods or cold periods in order to kind of help regulate the humidity and the temperature and the environment in which they live. And like I said, these chimneys are very indicative that, hey, I've got crayfish here. There's most of the times it's not an issue, but they can be a nuisance. They can cause issues with burrowing into pond dams and weakening those structures. Golf courses do not like burrowing crayfish because they're hard on the mowing equipment, because they form this really hard adobe structure as they dry in the sun. So here's an illustration of what some of these burrows look like. This is a primary burrow, or primary burrower. So you've got 1-2 tunnels that go down to the water table. You have the large room here, and then you've got multiple tunnels that come out, and then the chimney on top. These two, B, C, and D are all secondary burrows. You've got the chimney on the top. The burrow goes down to the water table, may actually go out into the stream channel or the open water itself. And then E are what most of the stream and reservoir lake crayfish do, is they'll burrow down, at least, if nothing else, for protection, to keep from getting eaten. A little bit about cave dwellers. We've got a lot of caves here in Missouri, and the cave biologist that I have spoken with that worked for our department before he retired said that there were a couple of species he would find in caves and pretty far back beyond the twilight zone quite often. And these were surface water crayfish, but they would get back into these caves and move in and out. Now, they don't lose any of their structure, they don't lose their eyes, they don't lose their color, but they do kind of like to move in and out of those caves. However, there are some that are restricted to these caves, and you can tell because they're blind, they don't have no eyes, no color. Their chela, or their claws, are very, very slender because they don't need to defend themselves as much. They are the top predator in those systems. And again, can live 20, 30 years depending on what kind of crayfish it is. And last I checked, there's about 40 taxa within North America that are obligated to live in those caves. So again, if there's water, chances are good you've got crawdads. Now, this is for me the really fun part. It's how do these animals fit into the environment in which they inhabit? What role do they play? Are they important? It's a pretty complex thing, but we've started actually doing some work to look at this. And one of the first thing that we want to do is figure out their role and their location in that food web, and how that energy flows up that food web. So one big piece of that is, well, what do crawdads eat? Well, the big take-home point is crayfish eat everything. They eat plant material. They eat animal material. They eat dead, decaying material. That's one of the reasons I like having them in my fish tank, because they're little vacuum cleaners, and they will help clean up all the other stuff that's in the tank that don't get eaten by the fish. Now, there's some research that shows that there's a shift depending on how old the crayfish is as to what they eat. The young a year tend to eat more protein. They eat a lot more animal material because they're trying to grow as quick as they can. Once they reach adulthood, their diet tends to shift from animal material to plant material. Now, that's not to say if you put a piece of raw bacon down there that it won't chow down on raw bacon. But again, they eat everything. One other important point. Because they're eating this decaying plant and animal matter, in a lot of ways, they are actually promoting nutrient recycling, because they're eating this larger material, breaking it down into smaller pieces and excreting it, and then it's then available for some of these other benthic macroinvertebrates that can then forage on this material and gain some nutrients out of that as well. So we're not interested we're interested not only in what crayfish eat, but what eats crayfish. So crayfish eat everything, and you know what? Pretty much everything eats crayfish. Literature shows that there's about 250 types of animals that feed on crayfish. Fish is obviously the big one, because they're incredibly important to the food webs in the water bodies in which they live. But a surprising number of birds eat crayfish. We have found crayfish parts in turkey crops, which is, to me, it's pretty incredible. And I don't know if it's the turkey that's going after some of the gravel in the stream to get it into the crop and break up its food, or if it's actually targeting the crayfish that's crawling around. Some of the shorebirds, that's pretty obvious, but I've actually seen owls take crayfish out of the water because it was late, it was getting dark, and we were trying to get our samples done, and all of a sudden this owl just comes down and goes into the water, which wasn't very deep, it was a wadable stream, and flies back up into the tree, and I look up, and I'll be darned if it didn't have a crawdad in its claws. So it's to me, it's pretty entertaining on all the different things that eat crayfish. Now, those 7 miscellaneous species down here, those are other invertebrates. For example, there are some beetle larvae and some dragonfly larvae that will actually specialize on young-a-year crayfish when they first come off the mothers, because they're small, they're soft, and these other ones are big enough that they can actually forage on those. So if you go back to your high school ecology or science class, and we throw up a food web, and if you remember that at about every time you move up a step on the food chain or the food web, you lose about 10% of the energy. It's kind of the rule of thumb. Well, here you've got an animal that feeds on these multiple trophic scales, trophic levels, assimilates all that energy and makes it a nice package for, in this case, a smallmouth bass. And because of that, what we have found is that the presence of these animals can actually help drive that whole system. And, you know, at least on the streams in our Ozark streams here in Missouri, but from what I've read, this is pretty similar everywhere that there are crayfish, is that they're keystone animals, and their presence drives the system. They can restructure these plant and invertebrate communities. As I mentioned before, they can actually process a lot of that material that comes into the stream, breaking it down into smaller pieces and parts for the other bugs. And they compete with fish, those juvenile fish and minnows, for other invertebrates. And what's interesting is some of the data that we've crunched for the crayfish in our Ozark streams is that 2 species of crayfish can actually have a higher production than all of the other invertebrates combined. And if you've done any sort of biological monitoring, and you kick your bugs into your net, and it's amazing. I'm still amazed. I've been doing this for, I don't know, 15 years, at the diversity and the densities of these invertebrates in these stream systems, particularly in these healthy stream systems. I mean, you can just have a net crawling with bugs, and you then extrapolate that to that whole system. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of bugs. And then you've got 2 species of crayfish that can produce more than all of those animals combined. To me, that's fascinating. And then from the angler in me, that's important too, because I know exactly what I'm going to use when I go fishing, because that's what these fish are eating. All right. So how important are these animals, and what's their status? Why should we be concerned? By the way, this is the freckled crayfish, and it's one of my favorite. It's found only in the Merrimack Basin in Missouri, nowhere else in the world. And it's just, I don't know, they're just kind of cool. They're all spotted like that. All right, you may have seen this graph before. It was in, oh shoot, I'm trying to remember which publication it came out of now. But, as you're probably aware, our freshwater mussels are by far leading, I guess, with the number that need some sort of conservation status applied to them. However, about 50% of the crayfish also need some sort of some sort of conservation status applied to them, because they are in decline in some way, shape, or form. It's interesting that when you start looking at the terrestrial environment versus the aquatic environment, the terrestrial environment is relatively intact. There's a quote from Larry Master, who's at the time was a biologist for the conservation, or the Nature Conservancy, and he said aquatic fauna have a public relations problem. He said even though they're valuable as food, models for medical research, and indicators of water quality, because they lack fur and feathers, it's difficult to muster public support for their conservation. And in one of my other presentations, I've actually got two cute little bear cubs that are talking to each other, and one says, "Isn't it nice to be an endangered species?" And the other one says, "Yes, especially when you're one of the cute and cuddly ones." And it really makes the point that these aquatic organisms don't get the funding and don't get the work on them, and can be a lot harder to garner the public support for them, because they're not a stuffed animal that you can have on your kid's bed. In fact, there are 4 species currently that are listed as federally listed as endangered species. 2 are cave crayfish that are found down in Arkansas. One is stream crayfish in Tennessee that's I believe only found from 1 location. And the other one is native to California, and it is this Pacifisticus fortis, the Shasta crayfish, and it is being threatened. When we start talking about introduced species, it's being threatened by another crayfish that's been moved in. So there are, I think the last time I checked, there's another, I don't know, close to 50 that are on the, quote, the list to be looked at and talked about and discussed, and may receive some sort of federal listing. I know in Missouri we've got, I want to say 17 or 18 of our species that are considered species of conservation concern. We got 35, 36 crayfish in the state, so about half of them need some sort of protective status, which goes right along with that slide that I showed you before. So what are some reasons for the decline? This limited range is particularly true for some of these animals. Some of these species have very limited distribution. We're going to talk about a couple that I worked on that are only found in the upper portions of one watershed, and that's not uncommon. In Missouri, we've got 13 crayfish that are found. Now let me back up. There's 8 crayfish that are found only in Missouri, nowhere else in the world, and then there's another 12 that are found just in the Ozarks. So it's Missouri and most of it's Missouri and Arkansas, but also a little bit into Oklahoma and Kansas. So you've got about 20 crayfish that's it. That's the only place that they're found. And what's interesting is you may have some pretty good diversity numbers, but when you look at it on a per stream basis or per watershed basis, you usually only have about 4 or 5 species per stream. They don't really play well together, and they've worked it out, so to speak, that there's only going to be a couple of species more than likely per stream, even though when you look at it at the larger geographic scale of a state or an ecoregion, you may have quite a bit of diversity. We've done a lot of putting our footprint on the Earth's surface, and have had some pretty significant impacts on those streams. We've taken the free-flowing water and we've dammed it up. We've straightened streams. We've removed gravel. None of these are really all that friendly for crayfish. We have moved species around, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In some cases, we have taken more of them than we probably should have. It's not really a huge deal, at least for the ones in North America. However, in other areas of the world, that is an issue, that they are harvesting those crayfish faster than they can reproduce themselves. And then everything flows downhill, and that's where the streams are at, and we've caused declines in water quality, which can have impacts on those crayfish as well. All right, let's move into introductions. I'm going to start with this table, and then we're going to kind of drill down to the watershed level. When we start, it's been my experience when we talk about introduced species and exotic species and moving things around, inherently the thinking is this has come from a world away, and in some cases that's true. And I suspect it's because we've done such a good job at educating about things like zebra mussels that have come from another continent. Those sorts of things that can have had very expensive and ecological impacts on our aquatic systems, that our mind instantly goes there, that, oh, it's got to be from a long way away. And in some cases that is true. The red swamp crayfish, Procambarus clarkii, which is native to the southeast part of the U.S., has been moved all over. And that's mainly because of aquaculture. Aquaculture is a multi-million-dollar industry for food mainly, but also for bait, for teaching, those sorts of things. It's interesting. I can go to the grocery store and buy a bag of frozen red swamp crayfish, and chances are good it's not from the U.S. Even though Louisiana is maybe, I don't know, maybe a 10-hour drive for me, just straight south. Unfortunately, it's cheaper to raise these, harvest these, package these, and ship these from China, or in some cases from Spain, even though it's a species that's actually native to the state in which I live. But if you go to the store, I'm getting it from somewhere across the world. Orconectes rusticus, the rusty crayfish, has been spread all over the upper Midwest, both by bait bucket as well as by people selling it for educational purposes. The signal crayfish was actually the first crayfish that was introduced into Europe. Europeans love their crawdads in order to eat, for food, and the signal crayfish gets pretty good size and grows quickly, and so it was moved over there among others, but it was the first one and has caused all sorts of ecological impacts. The other one I'm going to talk about is Orconectes virilis, the virile crayfish. It's been spread all over North America as well, that mainly through bait bucket. Now, when we talk about continent to continent, talk a little bit about Europe. They now have 15 crayfish taxa, 10 of which are introduced. And most of those were from North America. There were a few that came from Australia, but most of them were from North America. Now, the crayfish in North America contain this, or can carry this fungus that, in layman's terms, is called the crayfish plague. And it is a vector for that, but it doesn't affect them. They're immune to its effects. However, when you take them over to Europe and release them into the European waters, it was very similar to Europeans coming over here and introducing smallpox to the Native Americans. It flat decimated their crayfish population over there. They had no inherent defense for this fungus, and they continue to fight it today. And it's because we as humans have moved these things around. I mentioned earlier that the continent of Africa never had crayfish. They introduced the red swamp crayfish as a food source for some of the indigenous peoples there, and as it turned out, it was an ecological disaster because they ended up introducing a new predator to the system, which really upset the balance of things. And as it turned out, the locals really didn't want it. And so now they raise it and they sell it, but they don't actually eat it themselves. The crayfish in Australia get pretty big, and there are some of those that have been introduced into Europe, and there have been some reports of those being introduced into North America. I've not seen anything where that's been confirmed, but I read something or heard something on NPR a couple weeks ago about a group of restaurant owners in South Carolina that wanted to raise some of these Australian crayfish because they get bigger and they can sell more of them and get more money per pound. And as it turned out, I don't know what happened, but I'm going to let my opinion show and say, thankfully, it didn't take off. But that interest is still out there, despite our efforts of trying to educate people on why moving things around isn't necessarily a good idea. In China, they have really become a major player in the aquaculture industry of crayfish, mainly because of that red swamp crayfish. Now, as we look state to state, again, the rusty crayfish has been moved around upper Midwest. We've got a lot of teachers in classrooms that use crayfish as part of their education, and there's only about half a dozen biological supply places that will provide crayfish, from what I understand. And they were selling rusty crayfish, and when they were done with them in the classroom, they would release them, and they have caused all sorts of problems. Caused horrible declines in the fisheries. They have restructured. They mow down all the plants. They're very aggressive. I actually read a report that they had to close a swimming beach because they were pinching the brownies or Girl Scouts or whatever it was that was swimming in one of these lakes in Wisconsin. So, and it's been moved around again quite a bit. The signal crayfish is native to the upper or the Pacific Northwest, but has been introduced into California, and as I mentioned before, is causing declines in the Shasta crayfish. Probably what is the most dangerous, the most critical, and at this point, or to this point, probably the most often overlooked is this movement of drainage to drainage or watershed to watershed. And let me give you some examples. We have documented, I think at this point, 27 or 28 crayfish introductions in Missouri. Now, we are very fortunate that we had a biologist that worked for our department that one of his hobbies, I guess, passions, in addition to non-game fish, was crayfish. And he did 2 large-scale statewide surveys and produced 2 publications that were really good at documenting what was where and showing that, at least in Missouri, a lot of our Ozark crayfish are really restricted to a very small number of watersheds per species. So as we're going out and now collecting, we're picking up crayfish where they weren't there. And all of these so far, I have in quotations, are native crayfish, meaning that they are found within the state. They just aren't found in that part of the state. So, for example, the White River crayfish has been found in areas in the western and northern part of the state, and it is native to the Boot Heel area and the Mississippi main stem. But we're picking it up in other areas. We picked it up in one of our state hatcheries, and it's causing some pretty big issues there because now it came in as bycatch with some of the other fish that got brought in. And now every time a shipment of fish has to go or goes out, our hatchery folks have to treat for crayfish so that they're not a vector in spreading this introduced species around. The ringed crayfish has been moved around most of these more than likely are bait bucket kind of introductions. And then the woodland crayfish. I'm going to talk about that here. This is the group that I work on is the Big Creek crayfish is Orconectes peruncus, and the St. Francis River crayfish is Orconectes quadruncus. All right, blah, 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 blah. However, they are found only in this upper portion of the St. Francis River in southeastern Missouri. Now, what's interesting is those 2 species are found only in this one watershed, nowhere else in the world, which is pretty cool. But what's even neater is within that drainage, they have separated themselves out even further. So with the exception of 3 or 4 streams, I only collected them. It was either a Big Creek crayfish stream or a St. Francis River crayfish stream. Very, very unique kind of distribution within this watershed. Well, lo and behold, we've got a woodland crayfish that has been introduced. Now, this woodland crayfish is also found only in Missouri, nowhere else in the world. However, it is native to the Black River drainage, which is immediately to the west. And it first started showing up at this black dot here on Stouts Creek that I'm covering up with the red dot. All right? That happens to be the community of Ironton, Arcadia Valley area. There's 3 little communities. They're all boom, 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 boom. And this Stouts Creek runs right through the middle of this community. It happens to be about a 15 to 20 minute drive from a very popular recreation area called Johnston Shut-ins, which the Black River runs through. Now, the Black River is home to this woodland crayfish, and best as we can come to it, we think that kids may have collected crawdads when they were out with mom and dad, swimming in the shut-ins area, and brought them home. I brought crayfish home as a kid. I'm sure a lot of people did. And if their folks were like my folks, because I was probably like most other kids, I got tired of taking care of them and I suspect that they got dumped into the stream. Now, I don't know if we'll ever know if that's how they got in there, but that's how they first started getting picked up in the early 80s. This middle map here is the stuff that I worked on, and I started picking up this woodland crayfish not only in Stouts Creek, and you'll notice that it has moved all the way up to the headwaters in about, 14 years, and also started moving downstream, and in some cases was the only crayfish I collected. I also started picking it up in this big creek subdrainage over here. So we've had multiple introductions. A graduate student 10 years later came back and started picking it up in this stream and in Crane Pond Creek and down here in a stream that runs fairly close to Lake Wapapello. So we've got this woodland crayfish that's been introduced multiple times, has really started to spread throughout this drainage, which is, it's kind of sad, but it's an interesting, gives us an interesting look that we're actually able to watch this spread as it occurs. And where we see this new woodland crayfish, we start to see range contraction of these native crayfish. All right, so what are some ways that these animals are spread around? Hold on, let me back up just a little bit. Okay, so we've determined that they're more than likely causing declines in the native crayfish populations. But what bigger picture? What's the other impacts that it may be having? My wife is actually working on a project down there where she's looking at the impacts of this woodland crayfish on the rest of the invertebrate community, and she doesn't have all of her data done yet, but early indications is that there's a shift in the macroinvertebrate community in the area that this introduced crayfish is versus the natural system where it's not. And then that begs the question on, well, what kind of dominoes does that start sending down and cascading, and what kind of ecological function are you starting to impact? So again, vectors of spread. We talked about moving these animals all over the place because of food. It's very financially lucrative. You can make a lot of money at it. They don't take a lot of work and can bring some pretty good profits. As an angler, it bugs me to see bait bucket introductions, but that is a pretty big source for not only crayfish but also some minnow species, where when at the end of the day somebody is done fishing, they just dump their bait into the stream or lake that they're in. And up to this point, the regulations have been fairly lax on the dealers on what they're selling, because they're getting them from a supplier, and the supplier is getting them from who knows where. We have had at least one documented case in Missouri where the rusty crayfish was being sold as bait, and somebody saw it and said, hey, I think this is a little different, contacted somebody within our department. We got a hold of those folks, the bait dealer, and he personally went around and bought back, the distributor, he went and bought back from his bait dealers all of the crayfish that he sold out of that batch, and had a big crawfish boil and got rid of those. The biological supply I mentioned, as we did some survey work here in Missouri and found that 12% of high school teachers and 40% of college professors use crayfish as part of their curriculum. 72% of the high school teachers and 54% of the college professors got these crayfish from the wild, local stream or something along those lines. However, 12% of the high school students or high school teachers and 7% of the college professors got them from one of these 5 biological supply companies. What makes me sick is that, according to the survey, 64% of those released those back into the wild, regardless of where they got them from, and didn't necessarily return them to the same body of water that they collected them if they collected them from the wild. Another vector is the pet industry. As I mentioned, crayfish in fish tanks are incredibly entertaining. They're colorful animals. They're pretty hardy. They can be escape artists, but they're fun in a fish tank. And there are people that will go out and collect these and then sell them as pets. And then, you know, if you're done, or if you don't want to have a tank anymore, you know, you can go ahead and dump them, so to speak. And that's caused issues as well. And then the kids that we talked about. All right. Displacement methods, this is probably pretty inherent. They can either, you know, directly kill them, compete for resources, alter the habitat. I mentioned some of that with the rusty crayfish. There may be some reproductive or developmental advantages, and Eric is telling me I need to wrap it up. So let me quick get to some of the identification stuff for these introduced species. This picture here happens to be from a field guide that the University of Washington has put out, and I've got the web address at the end of this, that gives you some morphologic features that you can look at to see whether or not you have a red swamp crayfish or a signal crayfish, two of the introduced species that have been moved around over on the west coast. Oops. So the signal crayfish, the big thing that you want to look for is this joint right here, and it tends to be whitish to bluish in color. They tend to have pretty large claws, and they can get up to 7-8 inches long. I mean, they're a pretty healthy sized crawdad. And on the underside, it can have those claws can be bright red. Now, the surface of these claws and of the body itself is going to be relatively smooth. And then this is just a map that USGS has out. You can see here in brown are watersheds are states in which it's native to watersheds within those states, and then in red are the areas that it's been moved around. Red swamp crayfish is another one that you probably want to keep a lookout for. It's bumpy. It's red and it has these salt and pepper bumps on it, and it also has this black V shape on the top side of the abdomen. And again, it's native to the southeast part of the U.S., but it has been moved on the East Coast and all over the West Coast. It's interesting. New Mexico and Arizona, I don't think have any native crayfish, but they've got red swamp crayfish. The other one that I don't think that you guys have yet in California, but it could start showing up, it has started showing up in Oregon and Washington, is the rusty crayfish. And it tends to be grayish-green. It can get pretty good size, but it really, the key characteristic is this rusty spot on the side of the carapace. The other thing is when you close the claw, it'll have a gap right here, and the movable thumb, so to speak, is kind of an S-shaped. And again, this map is actually a little bit out of date, but it's native to the Ohio River Valley, and it's been moved across the upper Midwest, but they've started picking it up here, and it was because, they suspect, because of a biological supply. All right, so why is it important? Crayfish have been shown to spread disease. This is greatly exemplified by what happened over in Europe, and you can't necessarily look at a crayfish and know that it's carrying some sort of disease. It can overgraze the food source because they can overpopulate. These introduced crayfish can overpopulate in areas and can really mow down the aquatic plants, which is, as you can imagine, can have a tremendous impact on the other aquatic organisms that are in there. And from an economic loss, there's University of Notre Dame did a research project up in Wisconsin and found that in one county they experienced $1.5 million in lost revenue every year due to the decline in fisheries caused by the rusty crayfish. So it's hitting them where the pocketbook is. So if you're wanting to go out and collect crayfish, the first thing I want to point out here is the regulations. If you're in Missouri, and I can only speak for Missouri, you can collect up to 150 crayfish a day with a valid fishing license. That's because it's used as fishing bait. That's kind of the loophole. In some cases, you may need an actual collector's permit. So just keep in mind that there are some regulations that may apply as you are wanting to maybe collect these organisms to see what you have. If you have any burrowing crayfish, believe it or not, the best way to get them is to dig. And as you can see, this is pretty laborious work. We were down in South Carolina for a NABS conference, and we were digging up to about 3 feet in order to get down and get those crayfish. By far, my favorite is to collect by hand. I guess it reminds me of my childhood. Now, a little bit on keys. The keys, as I mentioned, most of those rely on reproductively active males and those gonopods. There are not keys for Form 2 juveniles or females. However, you may have a regional or state key that might be helpful. So, for example, we've got one in Missouri for the bait dealers that's only 4 or 5 species, and you don't necessarily need a Form 1 male. The one that the University of Washington put out doesn't use gonopods, and because it's only looking at 3 or 4 different species. So again, limited fauna. Rather than look for every state to see if they've got a book or something, I would suggest you just go in and Google crayfish of whatever state you happen to be in or interested in. And if there's a resource, that will pull it up. If you are feeling really spry, this is actually the Bible for crayfish identification. It's very technical. It's also out of print. However, they do have it online, and I've got this. You don't have to furiously write this down because this web address I'll leave up at the end also. Crayfish is in Missouri. This just happens to be an example of a state key. The one I'm most familiar with. It has its drawbacks, but it does. The nice thing about these state keys is that it gives you examples of the annulus ventralis for the different species, which are different for each species. It also shows you what those gonopods look like when they're not reproductively active. And Eric sent me a quick message that asked, is this Hobbs key free? And it is. You can just click on here and it's an online key that you read it and you click and it sends you to the next couplet. So it's fairly easy to use as long as you know the terminology. And again, I mentioned about an hour ago that there are some terms that are very specific to crayfish, and if you're not familiar with it, you're not going to know where the heck to look on that organism. Just a couple of quick tips on using a key, and you're probably familiar with this. I'm probably preaching to the crowd. Use multiple individuals if possible. Don't forget to use all the clues in the couplet. If there's illustrations, use those, and if there's distributional data, use that. As we talked about with these introduced species, you don't necessarily can hang your hat on the distribution data, but it can help guide you. If you come up with something squirrely and you keep running through it and you keep coming up with squirrely stuff, you may run across an animal that's been moved somewhere it's not supposed to be. I'm going to post all of this. This is just some drawings that have the morphological features that you'll probably need to become familiar with as you run these animals through the keys. They've got spines in places. They've got particular grooves in areas, and how those are shaped will really help determine where to go in the key. One thing I'll point out is this areola, the length and the width. Sometimes these can be connected, and that can be a pretty big key characteristic as you're moving through. Again, all this stuff will get posted, but the antennal scale that I talked about early on that was up around the eye and the antenna, one of the keys it asks, is there a bump here, or is this a smooth transition? And so that's something to think about on where on that animal it might be. The marginal spines that I talked about, are they present as on the left, or are they absent or reduced as the one here on the right? Sometimes it'll ask, is there a carina? Okay, it's just asking, is there a bump here in the middle of the rostrum? And sometimes that can be hard to see. You may have to use either a pair of forceps or a dissecting probe in order to run it over there, to run it over it to see if you can feel that bump. Other things, the suborbital angle, all this is doing is asking, is there a bump here, or is it more flat or rounded? Again, these are all things that as you're running it through these keys, that it may be asking you to look for. And again, the areola, absent or reduced, means the same as obliterated or narrow or well-developed. It just means, are these margins touching, or are they far apart? Some online resources. This is the Crayfish homepage, and a lot of really good information there. Lists of what species are found in what states. There's a list here by ecoregion that the USGS pulled out. You can actually pull that up, and it will give you the number of species for that ecoregion, and I think even give you location information. And then USGS also has some information on introduced species and where those are. The maps that I showed you earlier for the signal crayfish, the red swamp crayfish, and the rusty crayfish came from this particular website. And then some of the keys. Again, that Hobbs key, as I mentioned, it's online at the Crayfish homepage website. The University of Washington keys that I mentioned before, these are the volunteer guide and the Crayfish ID guide. They're PDFs they're very easy to use, don't use a lot of technical jargon, and have really good pictures, color pictures, in order to help identify what you've got.